Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. A lot of anger and outrage over the killing of 37-year-old Alex Preddy there in Minneapolis. Regular guy, from everything I read about him, 37 years old, was a nurse for veterans. From what I can tell, pretty nice guy. And they shot him dead. Immediately, of course, they called him a terrorist. That's standard fare, not only here in the United States, but all over the world, especially in totalitarian regimes. If they find somebody that they've decided to kill, just label him a terrorist. I mean, that's part of the legacy of the post-9/11, post-war on terrorism. That you want to go after somebody, you just label them a terrorist, and that's it. So, predictably, they labeled Alex Preddy immediately without even knowing any of the facts. He's a terrorist. And therefore, it's okay to kill him because it's considered okay to kill terrorists. And this comes on the heels, of course, of them killing 37-year-old Renee Good, another regular person, regular American. You know, we're not talking about illegal immigrants here. I don't know if they had any tattoos or not, or I doubt if they were members of any gangs, but there's no indication of that. But shot him dead. And there's nothing going to happen to any of these people. The U.S. authorities will come to their assistance and already come to their assistance without even knowing the facts. They have to do that. They have to have an army, whether it's the regular army, the paramilitary army like the CIA or ICE or Border Patrol or DEA. They have to know that those people are going to follow orders. And the way you assure them that there's no problem with following orders is you come to their defense. You protect them regardless of what they do. It doesn't matter what they do. You come to their defense. And if you have to lie to cover up whatever they've done, you do that. And that's what we're looking at here. Immediately, the false story, the lies, and of course, you're supposed to believe what they say, and a lot of people do, instead of what you see on the videos. That this is a brutal regime. I mean, this is what a lot of people just cannot fathom, that we live under a brutal regime. There's this conception that this is the same type of U.S. government that has always existed, on which our nation was founded. And you know, thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. And there's that concept that we live in a free country and that it's the same type of governmental system that has always existed in America. It's part of this indoctrination that takes place of children when they're 6 years old. The indoctrination continues primarily in the government schools. And so by the time a person graduates from high school, and then he goes to a state-supported college where it's the same thing. And some private schools are the same way because you've got a lot of public school graduates in there and they're licensed. They have to be sure they get their license again. So you get a lot of the indoctrination there about what a free country America is. But over in the public schools, you got the Pledge of Allegiance with liberty and justice for all. You know, where's the justice for Renee Good or Alex Preddy? There's no justice. Nothing's going to happen to any of these killers. Okay, look at the killing of people on the high seas there in the Caribbean and the Pacific side near Venezuela, where the military's just been killing people who they suspect of violating U.S. drug laws. Violating U.S. drug laws hundreds of miles away. I mean, why are drug laws, how far do they extend? All over the world? But they just killed them. I mean, and among a large number of Americans, there's no shock. There's no outrage. I know one person that said to me, he says, why should I care that they're killing a bunch of drug dealers? It's like, oh my gosh, this is what this regime has done to people. It has stultified conscience. This type of governmental system under which we live, which is totally different from the governmental system in which our nation was founded, one of the consequences has stultified conscience, paralyzed conscience. I mean, when people don't see anything wrong with just killing these people in these boats. I mean, number one, they haven't been convicted of anything. You know, our old system had a presumption of innocence. Now, a presumption of innocence is a person's presumed innocent till he's convicted in a court of law. And a presumption means you default to the innocence, not to the guilt of the person. So these people they've killed in these boats, they're all innocent under the old system of government that we had, not under this system. Under this system, they're presumed guilty because the government has accused them. Now, we've never seen the evidence that where the government's based this accusation, but regardless, it doesn't matter whether they show us the evidence or not. They are presumed guilty under our system of government, and therefore it's okay to kill them. This is incredible. We don't even know who was in these boats. Maybe there was people in these boats that didn't know that there was any drugs on the boat. Maybe the boat didn't have drugs on it. Maybe they had what they thought were drugs, but weren't really drugs. Maybe somebody was conning them. We don't know anything. But what we do know is that under our old system, the founding system of America, you don't kill people based on an accusation of a criminal offense. I mean, life is too sacred for that. Even if they had been convicted in a court of law of a criminal offense, it's not a death penalty offense. That life is too sacred for that. Now, in a murder, there's the death penalty. A lot of people oppose the death penalty because mistakes are made. But regardless, in a drug case, drug possession, drug distribution, drug conspiracy case, there is no death penalty. Yet a death penalty was inflicted on people without even being convicted. That's a ruthless regime. It's a brutal regime, but what's fascinating is that a large number of Americans were just indifferent to it. They weren't outraged like they are with respect to these killings in Minneapolis. You see, when it's an American involved, American citizens, there's a lot of outrage, and rightly so. I mean, life is valuable. You don't just kill somebody because they're protesting. I read where somebody said, well, they're really responsible for what they had, what happened to them because they didn't have to be there. They should have stayed home. In other words, don't protest. Don't do what they're doing in Iran. Just stay home, which is, of course, what they're doing now. They're staying home in Iran because the government killed a large number of them. Now, the federal government hasn't killed large numbers of protesters, but they've killed a couple here. And there's a lot of outrage, but I don't see that outrage with respect to those 100+ people that were killed out in those boats, or when the military attacks a sovereign and independent country in the attempt to kidnap the head of state of that regime and rendition him back to the United States. There was about 100 people killed there, but there's no outrage. There's no moral outrage that, my gosh, you've just killed 100 people because they're foreigners. That's where the stultification of conscience comes in. That when you've got the lives of foreigners involved here, this is what this different type of governmental system that we live under has done to the American people. And I'm talking about Americans who go to church every Sunday. I'm a Catholic, and there's a concept in the Catholic religion called the well-formed conscience. Does a person have a well-formed conscience? And I would suggest that while a lot of Catholics, a lot of Americans have well-formed consciences here, when we're dealing with American citizens, they can see that this is just really wrong to just be killing somebody that's just doing nothing more than protesting a regular person. They don't have a well-formed conscience, and this applies to a lot of church ministers when it comes to foreigners, because you don't see that same outrage when this ruthless and brutal regime known as the U.S. government kills foreigners. We saw this in Iraq, before the invasion that killed multitudes of people and destroyed the entire country. Remember the WMDs, Jacob, the WMDs, they're coming to get us. Saddam Hussein's coming to get us. Remember that? Well, before that, they had the sanctions that were killing multitudes of people. Now, there's questions as to how many, but the sanctions were intended to kill people, the civilian population. That was their purpose, so that the civilians would rise up and revolt against Saddam Hussein and put in a pro-U.S. dictator in his stead. And when somebody asked Madeleine Albright, who was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions was worth it, meaning worth the regime change or the effort to get regime change, she said, well, yeah, it's a tough issue, but yeah, it's worth it. That's incredible. I mean, that's incredible. Now, I don't know if 500,000 Iraqi children died from the sanctions, but she certainly didn't. It didn't bother her if it was 500,000. And there was no outrage among the American people over the thing. The mainstream press, it was like just nonchalant. And it's that same attitude with respect to sanctions. These sanctions are a brutal device. Their mindset is based on the mindset that drives them is the same mindset that drives terrorists. You know, real terrorists that go out and they set off a bomb in a big, apartment complex, civilians in there. And the idea is that this will cause the government to change its policy. If you don't want this to happen or continue happening, then you need to change your policies. Well, that's what sanctions do. You don't want these sanctions to kill more people? Then go ahead and change your policies. It's brutal. It's ruthless. Martin Luther King Jr. pointed out, this was 1967, that this is the biggest purveyor, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, the U.S. government. And we give short shrift to that insight, Fred King. We honor him for his civil rights work and his opposition to the Vietnam War. Now, not everybody honors him for that reason. There's still dead enders that support the Vietnam War. But we give short shrift to his real insight that this is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. That's something we need to come to terms with. Was he right? Was this at that time? But did it continue to be? And I would say not only did it continue to be, it became even greater. And that today it is the greatest purveyor of violence. And you've got this stultification of conscience when this violence is inflicted against foreigners. We see this with respect to Venezuela. Look at Venezuela. Venezuela is the perfect example of this phenomenon of indifference, the stultification of conscience. Here, the U.S. says we don't like this socialist regime. Some would say it's a communist regime. It's aligned with Cuba, communist Cuba, and for years, for decades, they even had a regime change operation where this guy, Guaido or something like that, where they made the new president of Venezuela. They're obsessed. This is part of the old Cold War mindset, the anti-communist crusade. They're just obsessed. The U.S. national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, which I have long contended are really in charge of the government. We think that Trump's in charge. I don't believe that. I think Trump's been absorbed by the national security state, the deep state, and that they are ultimately responsible for what's going on here. Remember, in 1989, when the Cold War ended, the national security establishment was freaking out. And they said, wait a minute, before you do the peace dividend, which was drastically reducing our budget, we can fight the drug war. So they were panicking, looking for something to do. We can fight the drug war. Well, isn't it a coincidence that there was no crisis at all there near Venezuela? Now, they had the sanctions. I'll talk about that in a second. But there was no big military build-up, regime change, and so forth. But all of a sudden, they get kicked out of Afghanistan, the military does, after 20 years, total waste of life, of American life, of Afghan life. it was horrendous. The way they used the 9/11 attacks as a way to try to get control over Afghanistan. And then after that, Iraq. And after 20 years, they get booted out. And just like they got booted out of Vietnam. And then you've got, of course, the Iraq disaster, where they ended up installing a pro-Iranian regime in Iraq. And then they provoked this Russian aggression against Ukraine by having NATO go all the way up and threaten to absorb Ukraine. And that hasn't worked out for them. Russia is clearly defeating NATO. NATO using Ukraine as its agent, essentially, its proxy. And NATO is the U.S., the Pentagon, the CIA. And so during all this time of the Afghan war and the war on terrorism and all this, China was going around the world making friends with people. Now, they're making friends with people in terms of socialism, giving them money, grants, building dams for them, building highways for them. Nonetheless, that's a lot better than bombing them and attacking them. And so while the U.S. was bogged down killing people over here as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, China was out in the world just making friends, including in Latin America. And that infuriated the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, infuriated them because they could see what was happening. China was making friends while the U.S. was just alienating people as the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. So that's part of what's going on with this Venezuela thing. Venezuela, they put sanctions on Venezuela, which were directed toward the Venezuelan people to kill them, through starvation, economic chaos. Same thing they did when on the regime change operation in Chile in 1973. Richard Nixon had told the CIA, make the economy scream. Told them in secret, make it scream, which meant chaos, crisis. And so that would pave the way for a brutal military regime. And that's what they did. They installed a brutal regime there. But here they put the sanctions on the Venezuelan people in the hopes of getting regime change. And that creates tremendous economic crisis, chaos. So people start fleeing. So while the U.S. is targeting the citizenry with death, what is Venezuela supposed to do? Just let people die? I mean, they let 8 million of them go. They could have said, no, you can't leave the country, but they didn't. They let them leave. But notice, if no country's willing to accept them, then it doesn't do any good if Venezuela says, yeah, you can go, you can leave. It's a way to save your life. I mean, that was what happened with 1930s, when Hitler was willing to let go of the Jews. And every country said, no, we won't accept them, including the United States. And so they had nowhere to go, even though Hitler said, hey, go ahead, take off. Well, where was Venezuela supposed to go? I mean, so China says, we'll buy your oil. Okay, we don't care about sanctions. And the U.S. is all up in arms. No, you have to obey our sanctions. You have to obey our... Why? Why should Russia or China have to obey U.S. sanctions? Who died and made the U.S. government the worldwide king or the worldwide emperor? And but this was infuriating the national security establishment that China was doing this. But in the meantime, these refugees are leaving Venezuela trying to save their lives. I mean, it's what Americans would do if they were faced with that situation. Anybody would do that. You got children, you got family. And so many of them went to Colombia, and the country Colombia, and they were accepted. I mean, it was great credit to the Colombian government. But when they came here, many of them, they were treated like garbage. I mean, here, the U.S. government had caused this problem. In addition to the socialism of the Chavista regime, there's no question. But it was a vice that was squeezing the the two of them. Without the sanctions, there would have been relative prosperity, not as much as in a free market, but there would most likely not be this massive crisis. There certainly wouldn't have been the massive crisis. The sanctions were very effective. And they come to the United States and they're treated like garbage. Oh, they got tattoos, Jacob. That means they're gang members. Oh my gosh, Jacob, they're coming to get me. They're coming to get me. And this is where the fear of the American people. I mean, the government has inculcated a deep fear of everything among the American people. Isn't it ironic? We live under the most powerful government in history, and we have the most frightened people in the world. They're frightened of drug dealers, terrorists, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, the communists, who else? Muslims. They're scared of everything. And they were scared of these tattoos. Oh, they've got tattoos, Jake. Oh my gosh, they're coming to get me. I mean, there were people in Montana that were scared that the Venezuela invaders were targeting them. They were locking their doors, And so the objective became to deport them back to Venezuela, knowing they would die there. I mean, that was why they left, because they were going to die because of the sanctions. So the sanctions caused the problem, or they contribute to the problem. And when people escape, oh, well, they're bad people. We have to, or send them to El Salvador to be tortured and incarcerated, possibly for the rest of their lives, life imprisonment. They had not been convicted of anything. This is what I'm talking about, the stultification of conscience, that when we're dealing with foreigners under this brutal regime, it's a ruthless regime, lots of Americans are just nonplussed by it. It's like, oh, well, okay. We live in a free country, and this is the price of freedom. Our government's keeping us safe. But what everybody ignores in this process is that when they expand this power, it's power over us. It's the destruction of our freedom. You see, we're inculcated with this mindset that, oh, our adversaries are Iran and China and Russia and North Korea and Cuba. I mean, they celebrated. A lot of the right-wingers were celebrating when they learned that out of the 100 people that were killed there when they kidnapped Maduro, the 30 of them were Cubans. Hey, isn't this great, man? Hey, we got those Cubans. Really? What's the deal with the Cubans? Well, I'll tell you what the deal is. They're obsessed. This anti-communist mindset, the anti-communist crusade, the whole, national security state. And that's what brought the national security state into existence. That's part of what changed fundamentally in our government. Prior to this, you had the Fifth Amendment, no taking of life without due process of law. Everybody guaranteed trial by jury, foreigners and Americans alike. The Bill of Rights applies to everyone. Our founders, our ancestors weren't saying, well, only Americans have rights. No, human rights come from God, and they're endowed. God didn't just say only American citizens have these rights. No, God says mankind has these rights. And there will be no taking of life without due process of law and trial by jury. And yet we live in a society where their taking of life is now, it's done. It's part of the powers of this government, the power of a state-sponsored assassinations. I mean, these killings on the high seas there in the Caribbean, they're assassinations. But we live with assassinations. We've come to live with assassinations. They do assassinate leaders in foreign countries. They assassinated these boat people. And I know that there's people that they've assassinated Americans. Now, I know there's people that say, oh, no, Jacob, they would never assassinate President Kennedy. Are you kidding me? Kennedy was the only president that took him on. What greater threat to national security than a president who sees through their racket, and whose policies are going to lead to the dismantling of the national security state and a restoration of a limited government republic. That's a naive president, you see, for them. This is a president that was out there making peace and establishing good relations with the Russians and the Chinese and the Cubans. Kennedy had an emissary having lunch with Fidel Castro secretly on the very day he was assassinated. A lot of people don't realize that because he saw through the racket. Now, at the beginning, when he was elected, he was your standard Cold Warrior like everybody else was. But he achieved a breakthrough, the breakthrough that libertarians achieve as to what's going on in this country. And so you've got, but you had this whole anti-communist crusade that was used as the justification for this major conversion of the federal government, one that is no longer bound by the Constitution. There's no declaration of war anymore by Congress. They don't need it. It's a national security state. Assassinations. Okay, even if you can't accept it that they would assassinate a U.S. president, there's no question they assassinate foreign presidents. I think most everyone agrees with that, right? I mean, they just assassinated this Iranian general not too long ago. Just straight killed him. Okay, there's no war with Iran. Oh, but it's an adversary. Well, they're not my adversary. You know, China's not my adversary. My adversary is the government that has destroyed my freedom. That's where my focus is, you see, and that's the trouble, that the government is so effective at convincing people that their adversaries are over there, that the American people end up supporting or indifferent or don't recognize that their own freedom has been destroyed. Now, there is one funny part of this thing, though. I mean, you got to keep a sense of humor when you're living under tyranny. But this is on Maria Corina Machado, you know, the woman that got the Nobel Prize, that gave it to Trump, and Trump accepts it. So, like, Trump can go tell people, I'm a Nobel Prize recipient now. I mean, how ridiculous is that? But Trump tells her that maybe there's a role for her in this administration. You see, what Trump and the national security establishment are doing is keeping this communist socialist regime that they've decried, that is totally illegitimate, lost the last presidential election, and that they decried for years. That's what the purpose of the sanctions was, regime change. But now that they've removed Maduro, they're going to keep the regime that they've decried in existence because they can work with them. So it's a national security state there. It's a ruthless national security state. It's the same type of governmental system we have here. Ruthless. They still have people locked up or disappeared. There's family members there saying, can you tell me where my father is? Can you tell me where my husband is? And we don't have any record of him. We don't have any record, even though they had kidnapped him. And they're still there. They're still somewhere, disappeared, buried, who knows. But it's a ruthless regime. And so Trump says, well, maybe there's a place for Maria Corina Machado. Are you kidding me? Why would he say such a thing? Well, I think it's because she hacked him off. Now, she's been very sycophantic. Oh, you're great. You're wonderful. Your kidnapping Maduro has brought us the first step to freedom in Venezuela. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. And, you know, she's effectively gotten down on her knees and kissed his ring, you know, and said, I'm ready to serve you. Just put me in power there. And so Trump says, well, maybe we can fit her in there in the communist regime. Now, they're supporting a communist regime. And see, this is part of the problem, that Machado referred just recently to the new president, who had been vice president, this Delcy Rodriguez, as a communist, which she is. I mean, she's a socialist communist. And this is her ideology. She's dyed in the wool. And then she said, she's just taking orders from Trump. Well, that's a slight against Trump. It's pointing out indirectly that Trump is working with a communist, and he's giving orders to a communist, and they're working together, and that he's working with a communist regime. And so even though she didn't criticize Trump and said, why are you working with this communist, and why are you keeping this communist regime in place instead of putting me in power? I stand for private property. I stand for free markets. I stand for what America once stood for. She won't do that. But indirectly, unwittingly, she was there criticizing Trump. So Trump says, well, maybe we can find a place for her in a regime. Let me tell you how long she would stay alive if she were to be shipped over to Venezuela to serve as, let's say, the head of the Department of Free Enterprise. She would last a New York minute. They would kill her immediately. You know, somebody would. It'd be like they figure out a scapegoat, a patsy that oh well we're shocked that this communist killed her, but I mean, can you see her going to work every day in this regime that she is opposed, that she's condemned, that she's committed to ousting? But Trump says, well, we might be able to find a role for her. I mean, surely she's not that dumb to say, okay, you fit me in this administration. I'll be the head of the Department of Free Enterprise. They would kill her in a New York minute. This is a brutal regime. Any regime that would work with a communist regime. And notice the right wing, they're not saying anything. They love it. Oh, this is just practical politics, realpolitik. We have to work with the communists. But at the same time, they're still trying to oust the Castro regime or the communist regime there in Cuba. They're still obsessed with that, even though Cuba has never attacked the United States. It's always been the U.S. that's been the aggressor. It's the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Assassination attempts against Castro repeatedly, acts of terrorism. All the acts of violence that the U.S. has exercised against Cuba, the invasion, the Bay of Pigs. I mean, this is the aggressor nation, greatest purveyor of violence in the world, and they're still obsessed with it, even while working with a communist regime. The CIA director, get this, is meeting secretly with Delcy Rodriguez. Somehow or another it reached the mainstream press. But notice the mainstream press doesn't say, hey, we want to know what y'all talked about. If Trump had talked to Rodriguez, they would say, what'd y'all talk about? But when it's the CIA, oh, no, ooh, it's the CIA. The CIA director, what's he have to do with diplomacy, meeting with the president of another country? And we can't know what they talked about. I mean, this is incredible. This is what's going on in this country. It's a brutal regime. It is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. There is no constitution here. And it's because of this fundamental change in the structure of the American government. It is a totally different government than what was founded. And one of those major changes, of course, was the national security state. That was the biggest one. But there are others. The drug war. I mean, that's the excuse they use for killing these people over there on the high seas. You've got the border controls that are the excuse for killing these protesters. Renee Good and Alex Preddy. That's all the war on immigrants, illegal immigration, and so forth, because their beloved little system of immigration controls has never worked, and it will never work. It's what I've said. I've said in my new book, The Case for Open Borders, a primer. The police state that we're seeing, this is a police state. This is how a police state operates. It comes as part and parcel of America's socialist system of immigration controls, and it is a socialist system, which is really ironic because the right wing hardly supports it. It's based on the socialist principle of central planning. And that system creates the problem, which they then use to destroy our freedom and our lives, as these two individuals are discovering, and suppress protests. How many people are no longer going to go to protests because they don't want to get killed? I mean, what a great way to suppress protests. It worked in Iran. Why not here? In any event, as long as people understand the problem and the nature of the problem, then there's a way out. You see, that's what I've said for 36 years here at FFF. There's a way out of this mirage. There's a way to restore freedom to America. But part of that is getting the diagnosis right. It's like a doctor. If you don't get the diagnosis right, there's a good chance the prescription's going to be wrong and not do any good. That's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you again for your great support of FFF. I look forward to talking to you next time.